Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Florida Sound Archive podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Kaiser, and for today's episode, I have on with me a very special guest. I'm excited to have on Scott White. You may know Scott because he was in one of the most memorable bands that come out of the Orlando area, Dragbody. They existed from the 90s to around the early 2000s. He's also a co-owner of Rise Above Tattoo. He was also in another band called Rail Splitter. I have on Scott White. Scott, how are you?
Great, great. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. It's great to have you on. We have a lot to get to. I'm excited to spend this time with you because I know that you have done a lot over the years. I've done my research. I knew a lot already, but I was surprised by how much you've actually toured the world. So I'm excited to tap into all of your history, both with all the bands that you've been with and also the things that you do tattoo-wise. So you ready to get started?
Yeah. Let's do it.
All right. Well, let's go back to the early beginnings. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in DeLand, which is, northeast between Orlando and Daytona, about halfway. Stetson University, that's where Stetson is. There wasn't much there, small town. There was, I was in high school from 88 to 92. There was, half a dozen people that were into punk and hardcore. So we drove to Orlando quite a bit, which is how I ended up here. This was just our weekend escape, pretty much. It's where everything was happening. We tried in DeLand. We had a couple little bar venues and some bands popped up right around 91, 92. But it never really seemed to catch fire. And I ended up moving away for school. Came back, landed in Orlando, bounced around a little bit. But ultimately, I kind of knew this is where I was going to end up. Back then, it was really cheap to live here. It was easy to live here.
Sure.
You could kind of disappear if you wanted to. So, yeah, I've been here, I guess, since around 94. I moved back to Orlando, and I've been here.
It's a pretty significant amount of time. And as you were growing up in DeLand, thinking about your early beginnings when it came to music, what did you grow up listening to?
Well, my dad is a musician, so we always had music in the house. He's a drummer, so he didn't listen to a lot of like rock and roll or anything unless it was a drummer band like Zeppelin or Cream. He listened to a lot of old R&B. So Huey Lewis, that was just the kind of standards for the time. But we always had music playing in the house. I think I was probably 1982 when we moved to Florida from Cleveland. That was when I discovered the Ramones. Rock and Roll High School was on HBO like every day. They didn't have a lot of movies,
Right?
But
they showed good movies like Rock and Roll High School.
Yeah, so I didn't know anything about the Ramones. I just knew that they looked cool, and I was kind of sold on that. But yeah, it was a lot of. He listened, we always had some of the like Alabama and some of that kind of stuff playing.
Sure. Did your dad wind up taking you to your first concert?
Well, my dad would take us to see his bands play because he was in like a gig band that would play, like bars and yacht clubs and shit like that. But no, I don't even remember the first real concert I went to. The first real memorable concert I went to, aside from like local bands, was Trouble and TSOL. And it was terrible. Trouble was awesome. TSOL was terrible. It was in the hair years.
So that was with, I imagine, the Joe Wood era, not the Jack.
There's the Joe Wood era, which I can't bag on all of that because I like those first couple Joe Wood albums a lot.
I'm with you.
But until then, it was, I started buying music, like my own music, in about sixth or seventh grade. Like if I did well on report cards, my parents would buy us a 45 or
Okay.
whatever.
Sure.
But we had a really good record store in DeLand, and the guy realized that we were looking for other stuff, so he started getting the other stuff.
Do you remember the name of that store?
Yeah, it was called Side One Records. His name was Dave. It was a wild, unorganized place, but I still have probably every record I ever bought there. Um, yeah, we had like the like music town kind of places as well, but Side One was the spot. There, a friend of mine, he had two older brothers. That was my introduction into actual hardcore, because they're a few years older than us. And I guess when I was in like seventh grade, he would bring cassettes to school with stuff copied on them, and just it'd work its way around through us. Um, yeah, the Morgan brothers, they're still around, still going to shows. But yeah, they were honestly my introduction into like actual hardcore outside of like the standard punk rock stuff.
Sure. Who was some of those earlier hardcore bands you remember getting into at that time?
Well, Minor Threat was the first, like one of the first bands, my fall in love bands. There was the Misfits, Ramones, pretty topical stuff. But I remember ordering some stuff just from Thrasher magazine, Fearless Iranians and Necros and some of that kind of stuff. Die Cruisin'. Um, yeah. The brothers, they were really into a lot of youth crew stuff and New York hardcore stuff. So that was kind of where I first heard like Cro-Mags and Up Front, the Northeastern stuff.
Right.
Um, yeah, it was, it was exciting.
Sure.
Every time I see them, I think about it, and I'm still super thankful that those guys, stayed in a small town when they didn't need to. Um, but yeah, off the top of my head, I don't honestly recall. Like GBH was a big one for me.
Okay.
Um, Obviously, like the Exploited, you couldn't escape at the time.
Right.
So that was like anything with that. But
Was that the first time? Yeah. Was that the first time thinking about those UK bands? Was that the first time you actually saw these punkers with mohawks and that sort of thing?
Yeah, other than in movies and stuff.
Right.
you
Right.
know,
Of course.
like that it was like a real thing. Like,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, GBH. I still love GBH. I love all of that era stuff.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah. It's good stuff. It's really good stuff. At what point did you discover? I know you mentioned your dad, was playing music, right? He was in a band. As
mhm.
far as the punk and the hardcore, at what point did you start to understand and discover that there was local stuff on the scene too?
uh, I found a flyer downtown. We had a coffee house that started doing some shows on occasion, and I pulled a flyer that I still have. It was a band called Love Gods and Leisure Suits from Orlando. They were an 80s hardcore band. And I was like, holy shit, this is here, right? Like this is happening here. And that was kind of one of my first connections with, like, before I knew what DIY was, like the fact that a small college town, very conservative, very redneck, but one night every few months there was a bunch of punks and skaters downtown, and that was probably the first time I thought like, oh, people just do this,
Right.
like this is just.
That's where they go. I mean, they
Yeah.
have to do something. And how old were you around that time?
That would have been I was probably 14. I want to
Okay.
say I was in like ninth grade. Yeah, so that would have been like 88, somewhere in there.
Sure.
Yeah.
Did your parents ever get a whiff of what kind of shows you were going to around this time?
Yeah. I think I had a pretty decent group of friends, and um, some of my best friends' parents were also friends with my mom. So my best friend's mom would drive us around sometimes, take us to shows, take us to skate parks. So we had that to where, um, but outside of that, probably not. You know, my dad had pretty much was kind of a music elitist, so
Okay.
he didn't like punk rock at all. Against his better judgment, like he wouldn't buy me, any like for Christmas. I'd be like, oh, I want a whatever cassette. And now, he'd get me something that he thought was worthwhile. Um, but yeah, I don't think they ever really probably considered it or cared,
Sure.
honestly. Yeah, I mean, my dad grew up playing music. He started playing in bars when he was like 15 or 16 years old as a job. So I don't think they were probably as scared as like the punk thing as some parents were.
Right. Sure. Did your dad ever record anything with the bands he was in, or was this mostly just like a live bar band kind of situation?
Yeah, he was just a player.
Okay.
Yeah, he played up until 25 years ago, I guess. Um, but
Good
yeah,
run.
he was
Good run.
just working musician like a lot of people back then.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. When you were going to school, especially high school, were there any other kids at the school that were in bands at that point? Was anything like that going on that you can remember?
No, I think my high school hardcore band was probably the first one in DeLand, so I've been told. And that was 91. We started that band 91, 92. That was a band called Shutout. And we played around. We played Melbourne a lot because at that time John White was booking a lot of shows at the power station. Um, so we played there quite a bit. We played Orlando quite a bit. Um, so I think the land, though, I think right after we stopped playing, a bunch of the younger kids under us started some bands, and there was a pretty solid scene there for a minute. Um, Through the mid '90s, there were some killer bands, which now a lot of those guys are in Bloodlet, and a bunch of them are still playing. Like they have a recording studio out there. There's things happening out there still, but it was always kind of an ebb and flow. Um, there was house shows for a while. There was a killer bar, like late '90s, early 2000s, called Happy Days that did a lot of hardcore shows. Um, as it goes, when they lost the lease, nothing picked up for years after that. But
Right.
it's not for the lack of trying. There are people there still that they put things together and they do stuff.
Sure. Did you ever play during those early years, backyards, in living
Yeah,
rooms,
yeah,
that sort of thing?
yeah. Of course, we played at our high school. We did a secret show in our AV room during lunch, where a bunch of people snuck on campus, which now you'd go to jail for. But
Yeah.
yeah, we played people's parties and I guess house shows before we really knew what a house show was.
Right.
Um, Orlando, we played out here quite a bit because at that time there was a lot of bands. Like early '90s, there was a lot happening out here, so there was no shortage of places to play.
That's good.
Even being like 15, 16 years old.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great because in other areas in the state, it may not have been
Hmm.
like that, right? So, did you guys ever record a demo?
Yeah. Yeah. We did like, I want to say 4 songs, maybe 5 songs. We just had it digitized a few years ago. I haven't put it up on anything yet. Our guitar player from that band died back in '09. No, '07. I'm sorry. And I never really dealt with that, so I kind of just pushed that stuff away. Um, but now with the Orlando Punk Archive stuff, we've been trying to dig out a lot of that shit, and Josh has been putting it up on his site, so it'll eventually get up there. It's pretty straightforward hardcore with guitar solos.
Nice. Did you guys record it like in a house, or did you guys actually go to a studio?
We did it at the Difference studio in Orlando. They did $100 demos. So pretty much every band out here recorded at the Difference. The sound quality is not very good, but it was $100.
Sure. Do you remember who recorded it?
His name was Dave Michaels. He ran the Difference. He did pretty much everyone's demos for 5 years, maybe. It was a cool spot. It was in a big storage unit. He was like a hair glam band guy. So it was set up with like a mega drum riser and his name on it. It was definitely interesting, but it was fun. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of musicians who came up from the hair metal or just metal glam period, some of them wound up getting into recording and engineering and that sort of thing. And
it seems like it.
Yeah. So it's not a stretch. So so as far as your first band, you mentioned some of the shows. Did you guys get any gigs with other touring bands that were coming through at that time?
Yeah, we played with a bunch of bands in Melbourne. Refused to Fall, a lot of Florida bands, because at that time, like Miami was popping off too. So John would bring pretty much everybody to Melbourne. I mean, just nobody that is mind blowing. It was 1992. But yeah, we played with a handful of cool bands out there. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, you just never know, because there was bands coming up, that they don't usually hit Melbourne before they went down to further south, or they'd come back up and hit Melbourne. So, because it's kind of in the middle of the east coast of the state. So, so once that band kind of wrapped up, was it Dragbody after that, or was there a transition period in between?
So that was my senior year of high school. I graduated. I moved to Savannah. I lived there for about a year and a half, maybe. I was going to SCAD, and that wasn't for me, so I split and moved back to Orlando. And I mean, I put a few bands together. At one point, me and Craig Chapman, that did Outback magazine and Outback Records, we had a band for a minute. We played one show. And then it was just mostly writing stuff. In '95, I'd moved back up to Cleveland to help my sister, or I was going to help my sister do some things. And while I was there, I was already hanging out at a tattoo studio here. One of my best friends started tattooing. So while I was there, I got the call that he offered me an apprenticeship. So I came back, and then in that time, the guys in Dragbody had a band called Contention of the Orders, which was a friend of mine from high school that was here going to UCF, a bunch of people that I had never met. But one of my tightest friends, Opie Sylvester, he was singing in Contention of the Orders, and he was getting ready to move back to Savannah from Stetson. So he was like, "Hey, you're moving back, right?" I was like, "Yeah, I'll be back in like February." And he's like, "Cool, you're singing in this band now. I'm moving, and you're just going to do this." I was like, "Okay." Because he was in Shutout with me, and we were super tight. And I already knew Mike, the guitar player from high school. So I was like, cool, and got back. They had a bunch of songs written. they wanted to kind of change the direction and get a little noisier,
Okay.
a little more chaotic, and we changed the name. And within, I want to say 3 months, we recorded the first 7-inch, and we hit the East Coast with Cease from Tampa. That same summer, yeah, it was crazy. Played CBs, played a bunch of shows in the Northeast. Had, as it goes, had van problems and cut it short, but yeah, it was a pretty crazy experience. And it just, from the jump, we just started. At that point, I was ready to like do this shit, you know? And my mentor at the tattoo shop, the shop that I was working at had previously been owned by Lance McLeod that sang in Mayday. So George and Lance were tight at one point, and George knew the opportunities that we would get from me being in a hardcore band, that, you know, being able to have that constant flow of like hardcore kids coming in. So he was cool with me being in a band. It was like, wanted everybody to hang out at the shop, and yeah, it worked out, and it was a good experience. And you know,
I want to detour the music just for a moment because now you're getting into tattooing, right? So I imagine you had done some kind of art, or you were interested in drawing or something. Was that something that was always going on in your life too, or when did that start to happen?
Yeah, I've always been into art since I was a little kid. And I knew as a kid that I wanted to go into arts. I didn't know what, you know, I just knew that, like, I want to be an artist, you know. As to how, who knows? But my art teachers in high school ended up sending out my portfolio without me knowing, landed me a couple scholarships. So I had a few options without actually having to do anything, because I was going to withdraw from high school. They ran out of art classes. So it was like, why am I still going to school if there's no art classes? They catered to my schedule, and they kind of like, this was one of those, you know, we've all had one or two teachers that kind of like really changed your life as a kid. I had two of those, and one of them made me his assistant. I got keys to the arts building at school.
Wow.
He got me jobs illustrating and screen printing. I designed a bunch of like police athletic league vehicles and shit like that I would get paid for. And then we would do the merchandising through the school for whatever jobs. And he let me bootleg shirts and print band stuff. And it honestly probably changed the course of my life, because I was just going to go to DBCC, get my high school diploma, and, you know, go get a job. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have college money. I didn't have any of that kind of stuff. So,
sure.
I ended up going to SCAD on a scholarship. But with the tattooing, I got interested in tattooing when I was about 14. From like Agnostic Front, obviously, like all those inserts, you'd see everybody with tattoos. My grandfather had a couple tattoos from when he was in the military. It was always something that I was interested in, but back then it wasn't like, I'm going to be a tattooer, you know. My mom would occasionally drive to this little porn shop out by Daytona and buy me tattoo magazines.
Okay.
Just, you know, the nicest mom ever. Just go in innocently buying me magazines, because you couldn't buy them anywhere except those spots, you know.
Right.
So I was always interested in it, and I was always drawing stuff that I thought would be cool tattoos. But you can't walk in a shop and be like, how do you do this? Because I did that, and I got kicked out of numerous shops, you know, like, which just added to me wanting to do it, wanting to learn more about it, that whole mystique. And, it was it seemed somewhat unattainable back then because it was a very small circle of people in every state that were kind of holding it together. So when I moved back to Orlando, my friend Chad Chesko, he had just started his apprenticeship, and just from hanging out around him, hanging out around the shop, bouncing around between living places. I started seeing like everybody starting to get tattooed at that time. I got a couple tattoos, I was like really chomping at the bit there. And just from hanging around, the guy that owned the shop, his name was George Turner. He was your standard kind of like somewhat abusive post-military kind of biker guy. And it also just made me want to be there more.
Did he have good stories he would tell?
He was wild, man. He kind of disappeared. He stopped tattooing years ago. He became a wrestler. He was wrestling small circuit East Coast stuff for a while.
What was his name? Do you remember?
For a while, his name was George the Nightmare Turner.
Okay.
And then he had another name that was like Saber or something. Like he had these like fang piercings that hung down real low. And he was really funny and a pretty nice dude for the most part. But when he invited me in, I immediately was like, I'm going back to Florida. So came back and hopped in on that. And it was most exciting point in my life. Up to then, I was just started playing in a band that everybody really wanted to do stuff and travel and just kind of fuck off, and I was tattooing, and there were a few stipulations. I wasn't allowed to have any bills. So that was my bouncing around house to house. Like, he didn't want me to have any obligations outside of tattooing. So I pretty much crashed for about a year, a little over a year, just around. The guys in the band were all UCF students, so I'd kind of bounce between their places. Managed to live without bills for the better part of about a year and a half during my apprenticeship.
Wow.
And then, made it work. I wanted it. Made it work.
No, it takes a lot of drive and focus, I feel like, to do something like that. And you had Dragbody, right? That was just starting out, right? And how did you guys get the name? Where did that come from?
That was something I saw in a newspaper article about a murder, unfortunately, that someone was being drugged behind a car. And the way the words were stacked, they just kind of popped out to me. They just looked good together, and it was like, oh, that sounds like a band name, I honestly didn't have any issue with the old band name. I was cool doing whatever, you know. Those guys were writing pretty cool, like, mid-tempo metallic mosh songs, which I was also down for that at the time. But once we started writing crazier stuff and that was Dead Guy was happening. A lot of that, like, a lot of AMREP stuff was infiltrating hardcore.
Sure.
There's a lot of those noise elements just starting to happen. And we were all like, this is loose and awesome, and we can have more fun playing live, And we ended up kind of just going in that direction.
Do you remember who drew the logo for the band?
I did all the art for all of this.
Nice.
I didn't do the album covers, but I did all the t-shirt designs. I did the logos. I did all of that.
Was that the first time that you have ever were starting to create stuff for anything you really did musically? Was Dragbody?
For myself, but I'd been doing stuff for local bands for years before that.
Okay.
Adventures in Immortality was a big band here at the time, and I hung out with those guys a lot. And Mike was putting out records under the Vapor Records roster, so I did the logos for those bands and the layouts for a couple of those 7 inches and a bunch of T-shirt designs. I screen printing out of my house. Yeah, it was just something. I was doing show flyers.
Yeah.
Anything I could like put a piece of art on, I was, you know.
I mean, you have this talent, right? And it's great that you were able to share that with the scene, really, at that
But
time.
yeah, you know, once people realize that you are willing to do it and the stuff doesn't look terrible, you know, you get nominated, whether you want to or not.
You get
You're the
voluntold.
Yeah. So I was the one for a few years. I still get people will text me pictures occasionally of stuff I forgot I even did. That'll have my name in it. And it's like, oh shit, I forgot that I even did that one.
Right. You do so much over the course of your life. There's going to be certain things that just fall off your memory a little bit till somebody reminds you of it.
Yeah, in those years, it was like, we had Figurehead Records here, and that was kind of when Figurehead was starting to kind of slow down a little bit, and other bands were starting to pop up, and there was a whole secondary scene, you know. So we were kind of the scene under the Figurehead scene. And they wanted their stuff to look different. Like Figurehead stuff looked really nice.
Right.
And that shit was pro and it was cool. It was like, wow, this is a local DIY label that's making stuff look legit. But as a teenager, you're like, I want it to look the opposite of that.
Sure.
You know?
Were you aware of a lot of those Figurehead bands like Green Today, Naomi's Hair, and that sort of thing?
Yeah. We had Naomi's Hair played our high school for Amnesty International benefit, and D-Nature was one of those Figurehead bands, and they were like one of my favorite locals, probably still. Yeah, I mean that was. A lot of it wasn't stuff that I was necessarily into, but I appreciated it. You know, it was more of like a college radio scene.
Right.
Yeah.
I think a lot of those bands were influenced by like REM and more.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And some of those bands were phenomenal, man. So I'll listen to some of that stuff now, and it's like, oh, this shit is really good.
Yeah, some of it has aged really well. I was wondering too, because a lot of that stuff may have been going on when you were kind of young, right? Mm-hmm. So as you've gotten older, were there any bands from that period in the Orlando or Central Florida scene that you've gone back and like, wow, I didn't know this band even existed, but you've discovered them later?
Yeah, a few of them when like during COVID, when the Facebook, the Orlando Punk Archive really started getting busy, everyone started digging out recordings. And Josh and Lance that were doing that, they were really adamant about like asking people like who has demos that, you know, you didn't release or whatever. And so much stuff went up at the time that none of us even probably knew existed, because some of it was just stuff, bands that were people from whatever band, and it was the first thing they did after that band, and they just fizzled out and moved on to something else.
Right.
You know? But yeah, a lot of that stuff, like I said, it's not exactly stuff that I'd say I'm interested in, but I was a fan of Naomi's Hair. They were always playing, and it was interesting because you listen to the record and it's like, it's a polished record. It sounds good, very college rock.
Sure.
And you'd see them live and they played everything double time.
Right.
And it was like, they would like blaze through those songs. It was like, this is crazy. You know, like live, they just sound like a fast melodic punk band, like the precursor to Gainesville, basically. But yeah, I think D-Nature was probably the band for me out of all those. They were kind of like at the tail end of it, but they wrote some really great, noisy, good stuff.
Were you aware of Tabitha Secret back then, who later became Matchbox 20?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, they were around. Again, it was, you would see them play. They would open for people and stuff, but
Right.
yeah, it wasn't really where I was at as a
I
teenager.
can
So
understand that. I can understand that.
yeah,
But of course, these are the things that were going on in the area at the
yeah,
time, and
yeah, and it's important to note that there was so much happening outside of just the punk scene. There was a huge bar scene in Orlando. There were like circuit venues. There were bands that made livings off of just playing cover songs, and there was a lot happening at that time. So it was almost like you couldn't escape it in one sense,
right.
because the venues that were letting us book those shows were those venues, So
Absolutely. There was a lot of shared space.
yeah,
So,
yeah, Club Nowhere, Sunburst Pub. Every night of the week, there was some weird something happening there. Was potentially the opposite of anything you cared about, but it was happening.
right.
Yeah, it was an interesting time for sure.
I can imagine. I know you mentioned about the Orlando archive, punk archive, I should say,
Mhm.
and they were looking for demos. Did Dragbody ever put out a demo?
Not as Dragbody. They put out a Contention of the Orders cassette, which we never went back and re-recorded any of those songs as Dragbody, because I personally I liked that stuff, but the guys in the band kind of wanted to do something else. And I probably did too, but I just wanted to do something. But the first recordings we ever did were the first 7-inch. We have warehouse recordings that we did after everything. We had almost another album written that we did nothing with, which is some of my favorite stuff that we wrote.
That's always the case. People always say, the one thing that never really got put out or released is usually a lot of people's favorites recordings. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you think at that point it was like 5 or 6 years into the band,
Right.
and that lineup, the core members of Dragbody, me and Mike and Scott, our drummer, we were always in the band. We had 2 bass players and we had a couple guitar players, and Tom, our last guitar player, at that point, he had been in the band for years, so we had kind of figured out that we wanted to incorporate other things. Like, I wasn't listening to a lot of hardcore at that point. I listened to a lot of sludge, a lot of indie rock. Tom was like super into Iron Maiden and Archers of Loaf. Mike was really into noise stuff. So we had finally figured out how to kind of bridge these things together and write those songs that were like, well, this has like some sort of filthy, noisy indie rock riff with just a sludged out doom riff for 4 minutes. And it was by far my favorite stuff. It probably wasn't as exciting live, but musically, I really wish we would have been able to at least demo the stuff properly instead of just, 4-track it in the warehouse. So boombox it, however we did it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Always find that to be something where it's interesting to kind of see where things go. As you mentioned, 5, 6 years in, you're getting into other kinds of music. Some things are going to influence based on the different members of the band. And it's always intriguing, and you're curious to say, well, what would have that sounded like?
Yeah, for sure. And I think touring, we toured for like 5 years straight. It was like some months we were out for like 3+ months. And I was pretty done with the hardcore scene. Like, that late 90s hardcore scene it was very silly to me. And I think everybody else was kind of feeling the same way, just with how people were acting in the hardcore scene. It just didn't feel like it was my people anymore. So at the end of Dragbody, Mike and I had started writing stuff for Rail Splitter kind of when we were like the tail end of Dragbody, because he and I lived together and we were listening to a lot of that. Like, I still listen to a lot of stoner rock stuff, like just, different heavy music.
Sure.
And that was kind of where Rail Splitter came from. Was when we got back from Europe, a couple of dudes just kind of disappeared. We were supposed to go to Japan and Australia, and we were all just kind of done, just burnt out. Like, we did a few months here. I want to say we did like probably 3 months here, and then came home for Christmas and left on like January 1st or 2nd, and did like 2 months in Europe. And at that point, we were all just kind of like, man, And it's funny because like Mike and Scott, they kind of put their college life on hold to tour and do these things. And Mike now is a doctor, psychologist. Mike Bolin, our first bass player, same thing. He's got a PhD.
Nice.
Works in sociology.
Yeah.
It's just funny. And, here I am sitting in front of this wall of this bullshit.
I mean, it's a nice background.
Yeah. Cool.
So you did mention again that European tour, and I do want to get to that as well, because you did cover a lot of different countries on that tour.
Yeah.
I want to say that was around 2001. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, it was the beginning of the year. It was January, February 2001.
Yeah. So you guys played a ton of shows in Florida, of course, and then you played a ton of shows just throughout the United States. I mean, places like, as far as California, even as far west as Washington and Oregon, and you played pretty much from the west to the middle of the country to the east. So you really played everywhere. Who helped with that first tour?
I want to say the first few things we went out on, Mike Bolin, our bass player, booked a lot of that stuff. And then our second bass player, Dave Kristofi, who lives in Miami, he did most of the booking. He continued to do that after Dragbody. He did a lot of tour management stuff with like Thursday and a bunch of those bands. But I never messed with any of the booking shows. Like, I would book local shows, but I didn't. Those guys loved to do it. It seemed like they were into it, and Dave was really good at it.
Yeah.
He was really good at networking with people, and he's from the Northeast, so he already had a ton of connections up that way because he grew up going to shows there. So he was kind of the obvious choice. He already knew everybody booking the shows. Like, our very first tour, one of the guys that I worked for, one of his best friends booked up at CB's, and that's how we ended up getting all the New York shows. It was weird to be a band for a couple months and then play CBGBs.
Right.
Yeah.
And that bill, I've worked, the one that I'm aware of was one with Shutdown, I think, played, and Floor Punch. Was there another show you guys played at CB's?
We played there a couple times. Yeah, that was a full Sunday show. I think it was Ralphie from Disassociate's birthday. I think that's what that huge Sunday thing was. Everybody was on that show. It was crazy.
Yeah.
I remember watching maybe 4 of those bands. Yeah.
And at times you travel with like other Florida bands would also play some of the shows, like Assück. I think Cavity may have played some of those shows.
Yeah.
Do you remember a lot of Florida bands? Were you guys touring together, or did you all kind of go up separately?
We toured with Assück. We toured with, like, most of the other Florida bands. It would just kind of happen that we lined up. But yeah, Assück was kind of one of our I would say, like, biggest tours, most memorable tours. We did a short run with Enemy Soil that was really cool. Cease. We toured with Cream Abdul Babar from Tallahassee for a
Right.
really long time.
Yeah.
That was great.
How did you decide to get linked up with them with such a long tour?
Tom, our guitar player, a couple of them were from Melbourne area, and Tom's from Melbourne, and they're friends. And at the time, like, they were writing crazy shit, like they had a trombone player, like, with a distortion pedal,
Right.
and it was just
You wouldn't
chaos.
see that in any hardcore band.
Yeah,
Really.
and somehow it worked, and they were like, you would see them live, and you're just like, I've never seen anything like this, like they're
Right.
so heavy and so noisy, and at the same time just have such, like, driving rhythmic parts. Yeah, just getting to know them from playing with them, because we weren't your average hardcore band, so the few of us that weren't playing kind of like traditional hardcore, we would tend to get lumped together sometimes, and we would kind of appreciate those relationships a little bit more, because I always kind of felt like we were a little on the outside of hardcore,
Yeah, I could see that.
and we didn't really fit in with, like, the grind scene. We didn't fit in with the noise scene, but we could kind of play with a lot of those bands. It just didn't happen in Florida very often. So that was one of the really cool things about touring with Cream Abdul Babar, was their connections with the bands beyond that. Getting to play with just so many different bands that were, like, not part of the hardcore scene, that were just crazy good.
Right.
Then we toured with Mid Carson July, who ended up being a Florida band, but we toured with them for months, and
Quite the contrast in the sound, right?
yeah, at that time they were kind of out of their, like, emo phase and writing more like rock stuff, like, not pop punk, but it was definitely more on, like, the rock side of punk, and that was a blast. But it was definitely weird. Yeah, we'd get places and it was like, who else do you put on the show? You have these bands that are already, like,
Right.
polar opposites on tour together.
Yeah.
But it was fun, great time. I still talk to those dudes.
Nice.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I ever saw you guys, Dragbody, at a festival was at Gainesville Fest 2000. Mid Carson July played that one as well. And that wasn't the first time that I saw Dragbody, but I just remember that show
Yeah.
and
That was
and
at the what was that the YMCA?
YMCA in
Yeah.
yeah, in Micanopy, I want to say.
Yeah, Dave, our bass player, was one of the people that put that fest on. Um, which was cool, because also doing that, he ended up knowing so many bands from doing that for a few years, that I got to meet a lot of people I still talk to just through Gainesville Fest. But those shows were great, man.
Right. You guys played a lot of shows in Gainesville, the Hardback, Common Grounds, and some other
Yeah,
places. What was it like playing up in Gainesville?
weird. It was always weird. Gainesville always had this weird kind of vibe to it that, on one hand, I really love. On the other hand, I hated, because if you weren't part of that, you just didn't exist, basically. Um, but the more time I spent there, the more I really got to love it, and I kind of got to understand it a little bit better. Um, yeah, I mean, we had fair shows there.
You seem to play Full Circle quite a bit.
We did play there. Yeah, in that time, in that little stint of time, we played there quite a few times.
What was it about that place that kept bringing you there? Was it just
I
booking
have no
or
idea. I don't even remember who was booking those shows. But that was about one of the only places that they were doing hardcore shows. There was a warehouse practice space that was also doing shows. I think we played with Turmoil maybe at this warehouse space up there. And it's interesting because like a show like that outside of Florida would have pulled a crazy amount of people back then. And in Florida, it was just kind of like, especially in Gainesville, where that scene was so far, or they felt like they were so far past, what hardcore was. It was always just kind of weird. There was always a handful of people that were super enthusiastic about it. But yeah, it's funny. I spent so much time there after I tattooed in Gainesville for a while, and just being up there so much and meeting everybody, um, I started to understand every city has a weird little scene thing.
Sure.
Whatever the attitudes are. But Gainesville was the one that kind of ended up drawing me in because it was kind of like a weird place where you could just go be a redneck punk and no one gave a shit at that point. And everybody was over the rants and over the whatever was happening elsewhere. And it wasn't like they were necessarily being assholes. They were just on a different trip at that point.
Right.
And, it just took me a while to understand that.
Yeah.
But,
it's got a whole different vibe to it.
Yeah.
I feel like. And you played other parts of the state, Tampa, for example, right? So
yeah.
was that a contrast to what you were seeing in like Orlando and Gainesville?
Yeah. I mean, Tampa was always weird too. Like that, I had a bunch of friends there, but Tampa was Tampa, notoriously heckling bands. And, if you talk to any of them now, it's like they will absolutely be like, yeah, we kind of sucked. But that was the point, No, we had some awesome shows at like 403 Chaos, and remember playing at like in downtown Ybor a few times, like really fun shows. Yeah, I'm out there a lot too. Like I still see a bunch of those dudes. Everybody's old now; they don't care. It's,
Uh,
but,
you mentioned playing at 403 Chaos. You were also on the comp that they put out too.
yeah,
Do you remember how you were asked to be on the comp?
yeah. Well, that was we were recording a record for Steve to put out on Schematics. So he had basically, like, we ended up becoming pretty good friends with them. And Mike Bolin, our guitar player, at one point in time, Steve had asked Mike if he would play bass in Assück, and Mike said no. And yeah, we just ended up being around them a lot, and they really were good to us. Like, and I think with Steve thinking he was going to put out the Dragbody record, he, obviously just put us on there. Like, everybody was on that thing. That's probably the best Florida comp that I can think of. Like,
It's solid, man. Yeah. I think you mentioned there were a lot. Obviously, there were even more Florida bands that didn't make that comp that could have, right? So
yeah,
to be on that compilation, to your point, it's such one of those milestones in punk and hardcore in Florida at that time, and it still sounds great today as it did back then.
yeah, and I mean everything about it was cool. The packaging was
Yep.
cool. The layout was cool. Like Steve from Assück put it out. Like, there's nothing bad about it. And yeah, I'm stoked that we got to be part of that. We did not end up putting the record out on Schematic, but that's a whole different story.
Where did the record come out on?
Um, so that stuff that we recorded, I want to say ended up going on a 7-inch that I think Jock Records put that out. Jeff Jock from Atlanta. I think that was the sessions because we recorded it at Morrisound.
Okay. Was that the
And
first time you were ever recorded at Morrisound?
yeah, we did it with Steve. at Morrisound. So the whole experience was crazy at the time, for being a fan of Assück in general, like, and just being friends with those dudes. Like Rob Proctor, aside from being like a ridiculous drummer, like just a great dude, like just a fun, nice dude to be around. And it was a little overwhelming, but it was cool. It was a great experience. I think that record sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Production on it sounds fantastic.
You mentioned Steve. Was that Steve Heritage who recorded it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Were you familiar with the history of Morrisound at that point?
Yeah.
With obviously with a lot of death metal, right? Which I know Dragbody is not a death metal band, but there's some elements I feel like that you could have played with more death metal bands.
Yeah, well, I love first wave death metal stuff. Mike Bolin, our first bass player, he was a death metal dude, like through and through death metal guy. But yeah, I was a huge Obituary fan, and those few years, we got Carcass Necroticism. There's like so many kind of landmark albums, the death stuff, like dudes live down the street, and this is what they're doing. This is crazy, so all of us felt that because a lot of those guys were around, and some of those guys like did come to shows occasionally. They would show up, they worked at venues. A lot of those death metal guys were bouncers or bartenders or whatever. So I mean, I was fully in high school. A friend of mine's brother was from Tampa. He did a death metal zine, and he's the one that initially got me into it. They moved to DeLand from Tampa, and he had these death metal zines and all these records and shit. And I didn't love all of it, but I loved a lot of it.
You guys later did a festival, the New England Metal and Hardcore Festival, where bands like Cannibal Corpse were on there, and 6 Feet Under, who, for those who don't know, was like a super group of bands like Obituary and Cannibal Corpse and that sort of thing. So what was it like playing that and sharing a stage with some of those types of bands?
Well, we shared a venue. We didn't share a stage.
Okay.
That was, I think, at the Palladium. So there's 2 venues. There's upstairs and downstairs.
Gotcha.
So like the mega bands of Cannibal Corpse, the New Misfits, like all that shit was happening downstairs, and upstairs was kind of like us and bands of that level. It was cool. It was chaos. There was some massive thing broke out, and they locked all the doors, and
oh wow.
Like, yeah, I don't remember exactly what happened. Nor do I want to bring up band names that.
Sure. But thinking about crowds like that for those kinds of festivals, what was that like for you? I mean, just being in that space and so many people there. What memories do you have of the crowd?
The upstairs venue to that room was packed because it was small, so it was just like a cool small club. I don't even know how much time I spent downstairs. I know it was packed, but I spent most of that time hanging out with Rich Hall, actually, who just passed away, unfortunately. But that one to me was more of a hangout session. I remember watching a bunch of the bands upstairs in the small room, and I don't think I watched any of the bands downstairs. I want to say somebody from Anal Cunt got beat up and thrown off a balcony, and then the SWAT team showed up, and I was outside, and it was snowing, and I was wearing shorts, and we couldn't get back in, and I was like, yeah, it was crazy. But wow. Yeah, that was a weird one.
No, I can imagine. And but that wasn't the first time Dragbody played a festival, right? You played something else prior to that?
I mean, we played a bunch of like hardcore fests, like Wilkes-Barre Fest and some of those. those are always good. I prefer that stuff. I don't like being on a stage. I don't like. I mean, that's like one of the things that I loved about punk rock is like the band isn't necessarily the show. The show is the show. The band is just part of it. You know, the crowd is equal parts of the band. And when we started playing, and it didn't happen often, but when we started playing places that had stages and that kind of stuff, I think everybody agreed that that shit sucked. So we would play on the floor, and sometimes they would not let us play on the floor. But we got away with it a lot of the time.
Right.
Like playing the church outside DC, like that place holds so many people. We played on the floor in that spot, and I remember playing there with like Zayo and like some like Page 99, maybe some of those bands.
Sure.
And we played on the floor just in a little hole of people. And then all the other bands were just on stage, like doing band stuff. And I was like, man, I don't have any desire to do that whatsoever. I just never liked it.
Sure, but to your point, I mean, there was a lot of shows that Dragbody played where it was on the floor, right?
Yeah.
So I remember the first time I saw you guys was down in South Florida at a venue called Club Q. Any memories of Club Q?
Was it the show where the fight broke out?
I don't remember there being a fight, but my memory could be fucked. I saw you guys twice there. The first time it was with Overcast and Shai Hulud, Disembodied. And the second time I saw you guys play, it was with Poison the Well. I can't remember who else played that show off the top of my head.
I want to say we played with like 18 Visions.
Yeah, maybe 18 Visions. I don't think I stayed for them.
Yeah, we played a show there where like the second song in, I ended up getting hit. Like somebody sucker punched me from behind. It was a dude I knew. He got pissed because he kicked this girl in the face and like split her lip up. First song we were playing. And I just said something about like being aware, you know, like that other people are there and wanting to have fun and whatever. And pissed this dude off. And I had my back turned to the crowd. We just started playing our second or third song. And this dude punched me from behind, pretty much knocked me out standing. The vision went out, everything went out. All I could see is Mike Rosen start swinging his guitar like an axe. Just shit starts going off. The lights go down. Ceiling tiles start coming down. Chairs are being thrown. And after that, I was like, yeah, I don't need to do that again. That was the last time we played down there.
Yeah. I mean, that type stuff, not totally uncommon for down in South Florida. Was that one of the first times you guys went down that far south?
No, we played there a few times. Just so happened those guys were in rare form that night.
Yeah.
You know, they were showing off a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah, it was kind of weird because I ran into him after that and said something about it, and he was just like, you know how it is. It's like, sure, yeah, it's a show. Whatever. But that was the hardest I've ever been punched.
Yeah.
Good on him. Miami holds it. Hialeah holds the record for hitting me the hardest.
Yeah.
I couldn't hear out of my right ear for like 5 days.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
That's it's not the way you want to open a show, right? When you're playing is being punched in the face when you're not looking.
Yeah, they shut the venue down for the night because a bunch of people were fighting outside at that point. There's that little biker clique from Club Q. Those guys showed up.
Yeah.
And it was just like, we just threw everything in the van and split.
Did you guys ever have any situations like that in other parts of the state that you played, or was that something unique to just South Florida?
Yeah, I don't think in Florida, nothing like that. Yeah, that was probably it. But, at that point, it was kind of a 50-50. Going to Hialeah to play a show. It was either going to be awesome or it was going to be that.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
you mentioned Hialeah. Where was that? So this could have been a different show. What show? Remember where that was in Hialeah?
I don't I don't remember.
Okay.
That might have been at Club Q.
Because Club Q was in Davie, which was not
I think that was in Club Q,
yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Most of the shows at that time, if they were hardcore shows, a lot of those were at Club Q at that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, we played there a bunch of times. It was fun.
Yeah. 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 So anywhere else down there that you remember playing when you made it down to like whether it be Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Palm Beach, anywhere else you remember playing?
Yeah, I remember playing somewhere on the beach with maybe An Acre Lost. My memory's it all runs together at this
Yeah.
point. But yeah, we played a handful of times down there. We played a bunch of shows with Brethren. Those dudes were great.
They were from Hialeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we crashed at one of their houses a couple times. But yeah, I don't know. We only made it down there maybe 6 or 7 times. We were trying to go north,
Right. Yeah, that's what I was wondering too, because a lot of the shows it seemed like you guys were playing were further north than necessarily south. So, but you played with Cavity a couple times. So were you a fan of their music kind of?
Yeah. Yeah, Cavity's like the most underrated band from Florida. They never put out a bad anything.
Right. Okay.
You rarely hear people talk about them now. And it's interesting because that kind of music now is, it's pretty common because they were definitely, riding that sludge stuff. Just then it was very niche, I think. And there's a handful of people that dug it. But yeah, I loved Cavity. Yeah, getting to play with them a few times was definitely a highlight.
Right.
Yeah.
I can imagine. And another band that I see the 7-inch behind you that I'm a huge fan of, who was kind of sludgy, very riff heavy, was Floor. Did you ever get a chance to play or see Floor?
I saw. We never played with Floor in Dragbody. Saw them a lot. We played with them a lot in Rail Splitter. I want to say probably half the shows we played were with Floor or one of those bands. And we played with Dove a bunch, Floor a bunch. Yeah.
You guys play with a lot of really amazing bands. I mean, we can sit here and probably list dozens of them. And do any really stand out as far as in your memory? Because you played with a lot of these bands earlier on in their career, really in their journey, and some are still going, and some are no longer playing. Some may pop up for a reunion show here from time and time again. Are there any in your memory that just stand out as some of your personal favorites to play with that were from Florida?
Well, those early Hot Water Music shows are some of my favorite just life experiences. Like that shit was really magical at that point. And those guys ended up being really good to us as a band. Like they would throw us on shows if we were around where they were playing. And they were all really super nice dudes. And those live Hot Water Music shows early on were just incredible. Like it was like a religious experience almost. It was just the vibe of what was happening. But yeah, I don't know. Like there were so many good bands. It's kind of hard to even go through that for me and pick any. Like some of my favorite, and being biased from Orlando, some of my favorite shows were with our friends here. Like D.I.Y. Records. And, just getting to be in a small room with all your friends and just do whatever you want.
Right. I'm glad you brought up D.I.Y. Records because that was definitely one of the spaces where a lot of shows were happening, right?
Yeah.
So what are your memories of D.I.Y. Records and just some of the times you had gigs there, but also had a chance to see some shows?
Yeah, D.I.Y. was like the of Orlando for a long time. And Jeff, he was doing something that nobody else was willing to do. It just, we needed it, certainly. Like, we had gone through a handful of record stores that lasted maybe 2 years at most. And they would end up kind of bringing in other stuff to try to pay the bills. And Jeff, he managed to be able to stick around for a handful of years. And, he was older than us. Jeff is still around. I talk to him occasionally. Jeff was, he was a skinhead. He was a sharp. So he was also bringing some stuff into the scene here that didn't really exist before. We had no shortage of Nazi skinheads here, but there was maybe half a dozen skinheads that weren't into that. So when Jeff popped up, it kind of brought some interest into some other music and kind of made some people realize that, like, oh, not all of these dudes are shitty. But yeah, that venue when he was out towards UCF with the back room, when he had like the venue room, that was great. Like, I think we played with Solarized there. It was Alabama Thunder Pussy, Solarized, and us, which is a really bizarre bill.
That is.
But I loved both of those bands at the time, so it was like super weird,
Remember the crowd for a show like that when you guys got on?
It was, I mean, pretty minimal, to be honest with you. Like, the shows that drew there were the bands, but there were always people at D.I.Y, whether there was a show or not. So there was always something happening there. And, honestly, I always kind of thought that I would end up doing that. Like, when I first was going to open the tattoo studio, that was my plan. I wanted to do, I want to sell records and have a space for bands to play, just kind of a little community space. And maybe I still will at some point. I don't know. Yeah, that place, it was hugely important here.
Yeah. No doubt. I mean, as you mentioned, it was a space that, like, every Orlando area, so Central Florida band was playing at, right? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, he put out the D.I.Y comp, which was also a killer comp.
Yep.
Like, every band on that was good. We ended up not being on that because we didn't have anything ready.
I was wondering about that. Like, why weren't Dragbody on that comp?
Yeah, we were supposed to be, and just kind of dropped the ball on it. And honestly, I still, to this day, kind of bums me out just because of what it is. It was
right.
a document of Orlando at the time.
Absolutely.
And,
but also at the same time, I feel like, too, I mean, there's a lot of bands that may have played D.I.Y records and other venues in the Central Florida area, but not everybody put out as many records as Dragbody did. You guys really have a lot of tangible recordings, because some of those other bands that may not have put out anything, they're not as remembered, right? Because they don't have a lot. You might have a flyer with their name on it, or may remember seeing them at a show, but you guys really put out a lot of music on 7 inches, and also there was some a CD as well. I think like a compilation of, and then you had the record you guys did with Steve Albini, right? Produced.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
That just happened really by emailing him. It was like, sent him a tape, and he was like, "Yeah, that's cool. That could work." And he gave us a week at kind of a discounted price, and it was awesome. Spent a week up there.
Was that in Chicago?
Yeah, that was. It was cool. And going into that studio at that time, for me, it was really strange because a lot of those Chicago bands, those indie bands, were in heavy rotation for me. So walking in and having like, oh, here's a dude from, whatever band, Silkworm, or, whatever band was, whoever was working or recording there. I was a little starstruck, and obviously it's Steve Albini, so
Right.
you hear the stories of like what a weirdo the guy was, and we didn't really get any of that. He was really great. He would stop like mid-song and be like, let's go drink coffee and play billiards. And be like, okay. And then he would write down what time. We would go like do whatever for an hour. And then he would be like, okay. And he'd put his zipper jumpsuit back on and go back to work. And it was a really awesome experience. I can't say that I like the recording. I don't know if any of us really liked that recording. After it got mastered, it got pretty flattened, and none of us were really happy with it, which is why we never went back to it. We're just now talking about having it remastered and finally putting it out on vinyl. So we'll see if that happens this year. That was the plan.
And that's the Flip the Switch from 1999, for those that aren't familiar with it. And you mentioned now you may revisit it and do a vinyl release, because that is one of the very few outputs from the band that was CD only.
Yeah. We've talked about it off and on. And I think now with Steve Albini passing, it was kind of a weird spot. Like, do we want to do this? Do we want to keep this as he did it? But I think now all of us are just kind of like, let's see if we can get it how we actually wanted it to sound. And a friend of ours, Sanford Parker, he works with electrical audio. He's an engineer. And we're talking to him about having him remaster it at the studio. And he was around for the early years of Dragbody, so it would be kind of cool.
Yeah.
He lived in Orlando and was a good friend, so it'd be kind of cool to have him do it at Electrical Audio. But who knows? We've definitely had the group conversations about it, and we've talked to a few people about potentially releasing it. Just hasn't happened yet. We just need to get our shit together.
Sure.
Yeah.
It'd be very interesting to hear the different mastering, kind of maybe what more of the vision was for that record. And I've heard many original releases of albums from a variety of different bands, different genres, and you hear another version of it the way that they really intended it to be, and it could have a totally different vibe to it.
Yeah. I love some. There's no denying that Albini did some amazing stuff, but like anyone, it's what he does isn't going to work for everything.
Sure.
And
absolutely.
Personally, I can't speak for the other guys, but I don't think it was a good fit in hindsight. Like I said, before it was mastered, it sounded great. And then when we got the CDs back, it was like, holy shit, what happened here? But
can understand that.
Yeah, we finally actually own the rights to that record. It was kind of in limbo for a really long time, because when Now or Never was sold, it turned in, everything from Now or Never went on to Abacus, and Abacus was owned, and they wanted us to buy the rights back for the album. And at the time, we just weren't that concerned with it, but we couldn't put it up on streaming services, so that stuff was unavailable.
Yeah.
And then a few years ago, Dave I think he ended up getting in contact with the guy that ran the label, and there was a clause in the contract that if they didn't digitize it or re-release it, after so many years, the rights went back to us. So we ended up not having to buy it back, luckily. So
Was that the first time you guys ever had something like that where there was like a contract and some red tape?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And even then, it was just kind of like the opposite of what I cared about.
Sure. Right. Right. Of course. Right. 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 Uh, you guys also recorded with Mark in Ignaffo, right? Who recorded some Smashing Pumpkins back, I think, in the late '80s.
Yeah,
So how'd you guys get linked up with him?
that was pretty much the place. Um, Everybody was recording at real time. He also did like $300 demos or whatever it was, and pretty much every Orlando band was recording with Mark. That was just the place to go. So we went there. We recorded the first 7-inch with him, and a couple other things with him. And Mark's a great dude. I actually just bought the bootleg of the Smashing Pumpkins Ignaffo sessions
Oh, no.
because it has his name listed on it.
Yeah, of course.
And none of the releases have his name listed on it.
Right.
So I bought this one. I sent him a picture of it, and he was like, that's pretty cool.
It's funny because sometimes the person who was involved doesn't even have a copy themselves. So I'm not sure if he does or doesn't, but it's not uncommon.
He said he has a copy of a one of like 4 or 5 cassettes that Corgan made when they did it. But otherwise, yeah. He had one of the demos at the studio years ago. That was pretty cool, but
yeah.
Mark is a good dude. He's still doing it too. He's still out there, still does the digital transferring and all that stuff.
Yeah, he'd be someone neat to have on the podcast down the line. I'll have to see if I can get in touch with him.
Yeah, I mean, he's recorded every Daytona band,
Right.
every Orlando band. Like that was the place that all of us were going to because
Absolutely.
we got good quality and it didn't break us. He seemed to enjoy it. I don't know. I mean, there were a few times where he probably didn't, but yeah.
How are you guys in the studio? Like, was it a different vibe depending on what studio you were in, or were you guys always pretty much the same?
I don't know. It was different. Like every time we went in, one session at real time turned into, a near fist fight, headbutt session is when we referred to it. But no, I think we all just had fun in the studio, honestly.
Yeah.
We were there wasn't a point of that band where we weren't amped on doing stuff. Like until the very end there, I think we stayed on 10 most of that time. And, I think we all had the same kind of end goal in mind. So, it was, once we got that last lineup, it seemed to work pretty well.
Were you guys ever trying to get signed by like one of the more major hardcore labels at that point? Was there anything even going on where you were being courted by a hardcore label that was, putting out more of the more, I know I hate to use the word popular, but they were just some of the more well-known bands at that time?
No, I mean, not necessarily. We talked to John Eulogy and decided not that all of us, we just were like, we're going to be the only one of these bands on this label. We talked to Earache. They flew the guys up. They actually had a pretty decent situation. They wanted us just to do one record. But we had no control over who we toured with, any of that stuff. So we didn't do that. Most of the other labels at the time, if we did send them things, they were aware of us, but we just weren't hardcore enough. We didn't have breakdowns.
Right.
We had fall apart moments. We ended up getting to the point where I don't remember who it was, but it was like, as long as you start on time and stop on time, what happens in the middle doesn't matter. Just make sure those things are tight. And that was kind of where we put our focus. We wanted it to feel like it was falling apart. and that wasn't exactly happening yet. If we would have held out 5 more years, that probably would have changed. But I feel like every band I'm in is just not at the, we're a couple years too early on whatever shit's happening.
Yeah. But you guys had the chance to go out to Europe and you played a lot of different countries out there, from
Yeah,
Spain to Switzerland to Germany and amongst many others. What was the scene like there? Did you feel like there was more of a love and reception as you went to play Europe?
absolutely. Yeah. Everything in Europe was great. Like, the people there were just amped that there were hardcore shows happening. Um, you can drive 3 hours and be in a different country, and that's a different scene. So I don't even remember having a bad show in Europe. Like, I feel like that whole time the shows were good, and it was just like just feeling like, holy shit, we've never sold this much stuff, or like had this many people want to talk and hang out, because that's really like when you finish playing the set, like you kind of want to interact with people, like I don't need people telling me if it was good or bad, but that energy's there.
Right.
And in Europe, it just seemed like just a different vibe entirely. The shows were just good. Like, it was just a great experience. We did have a band. Most of the bands would bring up New York hardcore. I don't think they were familiar with how far we were from New York. So, like, every now and again, like, oh, this song's for Dragbody. They play like a Madball song, and it'd be like, I don't even know what this is,
Right.
But yeah, it was cool. Like,
They could just think though, like it's in the US, so it's
yeah. Well, I don't think they consider how massive the United States
right.
was.
A lot of times people don't really realize how massive it is.
Yeah.
When you're outside of it.
Yeah. No, it was awesome. We played with some great bands. There's still people I talk to like regularly from that tour. It was a good time. It was cold. Europe in January and February,
right,
for a bunch of Florida kids was like, that was a change, but it was great. Like,
you were gone for so long. So what do you remember about where you were staying too? Like, where were you sleeping?
So we had a home base in Mannheim. There's a band called Stack from Germany, like phenomenal, like power violence hardcore band. Two of those guys did record labels, and they drove us and they booked a bunch of the shows for us. And for the most part, we just stayed in squats. We stayed in hostels, crashed with people. Like, we played in some we stayed in some pretty sketchy places, like maybe bad idea spots. Buildings with no walls, but like, when are you going to get to do this again?
That's a fair point.
Sure, there might be a murder mattress on the floor, but what a beautiful view.
Once in a lifetime view.
Yeah.
Wow. So out of the various countries and cities that you played, I imagine there could have been some time to explore some of those places. Was there?
Yeah, there was quite a bit of time because your drive time is so much shorter there.
Sure.
So pretty much every major city we got to like poke around in. We ran into a bunch of Florida people over there. That was kind of funny.
Oh, wow.
Ran into some Gainesville folks in Spain. Just people in England. It was just very weird. But yeah, we got to do a bunch of the sightseeing stuff, and it was awesome. We came back with money. It was not a lot of money, but it paid for itself. And,
right.
If we had $100 in our pocket after that, it was a success. We got to live for free for 2 months. and travel
See
and
the world. I mean,
yeah, play these songs, and it didn't cost us anything. Um, it was great. A lot of the people that we were around, for the most part, were really great. It was a really good experience.
was there a certain country or city that just stands out more than some of the others? Just you just love the beauty of it, the architecture, not just the fact that maybe it was a good show, but you just like the scene of that area.
Man, there was so much of it. Like,
Yeah, I can imagine.
I feel like Germany, you hear so much stuff about Germany growing up in the U.S. I couldn't really fathom what it really felt like to be there, you know, um, and yeah, there's a lot of gray. There's a lot of black trench coats, but I thought the cities were all incredible. Same with Spain. I loved Spain. I really loved Switzerland. Um, yeah, there wasn't anything bad.
Yeah.
There's every day we'd wake up to something different.
Sure.
Just different visual landscape entirely. And
Right. No, I can imagine. And it's funny you mentioned some of the people after the show just wanting to, chat and talk and what have you. But as far as like the pits compared to in the US, the shows you played, was there a difference in how people were reacting when the band was playing?
Yeah, there was back then. I mean, see, this, it was 2001. So there was still a lot of circle pits. There was still a lot of back and forth, side to side shit. There was not as much karate kicking. There was definitely, for me, there was a little more of a punk element still. Whereas here at that point, hardcore was completely disconnected from punk. And that was one of the things that kind of lost me on it. So being over there was just kind of like, the shows, the bands wouldn't all be the same band. You wouldn't necessarily have 5 hardcore bands. The crowd, there'd be just anybody that lived around there that just wanted to go see some bands play would be there. And it was awesome. I think in Barcelona we played with like some interpretive dance thing that was like a bunch of crust punks
Okay.
that were doing this like theatrical shit. It was weird. It was under a bridge in I don't know. Yeah, there's just some. It was great. It was fun. I hope my kid gets to experience some shit like that,
Yeah. And I know just thinking about as time goes on, a lot of the places that you may have once played don't exist anymore. Sometimes they may not have even been a place that did a lot of shows. It could have been a one-off kind of situation.
Yeah.
But a lot of those places do not exist anymore. Are there any still around that you can remember that you played at that are still hanging in there?
Man, I don't think so, other than like the Social or some of those spots that are, they've changed hands over the
Right.
years. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, no. It's funny that you mentioned that, because sometimes when we're driving around, I'll be like, this used to be a venue space and we played with whoever there, and whatever. And yeah, most of it is gone. Like I would say all of it.
Yeah.
But that's how it goes.
That's how it goes.
Orlando is so massive now. It is not the same city it was 20 years ago.
They do that type of stuff. And I know you mentioned the Social, and for those that may not know, pre-Social, the Sapphire Supper Club, you guys played there a couple times, right?
Yeah, we played there quite a few times.
Yeah.
I think actually our last show or our second to last show, one of the last 2 shows we played there was with, I think, DRI and, like Fortitude and some homies, and that was I think 2002, because that year I think we only played 2 shows at DRI, and then we played at Will's with Bloodlet and Keith Dalrymple, who was in a million bands here. He was filling in on bass for us because Dave had moved to South Florida and just was doing other stuff. So Keith played a couple shows with us, which was cool because he was the original bass player in Bloodlet as well. So it was like kind of full circle thing, it goes back to just playing shows with your friends.
Right.
I think most of us knew that was our last couple shows, but none of us really said it.
How did you know that was the end?
Well, I knew Scott, our drummer, was looking to move back to Vero or somewhere down there. I knew Mike had to finish school. So it was like, man, it's been, 5 or 6 years of these guys putting off school. So, at that point, I was already situated in a career that I was able to kind of float in and out of. The guy I worked for at that time, I worked at a shop for like 10 or 11 years. And my boss is from the UK. And, he grew up listening to punk rock and stuff. So he would let me hit the road and come back as long as I came back, So for me, it wasn't so much, I had no responsibilities other than like, I just don't want to tour for a while. But I could tell everybody else was pretty done with it.
Sure. I mean, you had a really good run.
Yeah, we did a lot. I'm proud of what we did.
Yeah.
I'm happy with the stuff we wrote. And I mean, I would like to get it out and have it available. People hit me up. I've been getting a lot of younger, like early 20s, hardcore kids hitting me up about it. That's interesting, because I'm 50 years old. So it's wild to have somebody that's 20, ask about a band, my band from back then, and
sure,
wanting it on vinyl.
Right. I will say that when you listen to a band like Dragbody, I'm just kind of plumping it into like the hardcore punk for just a second. If you listen to some of the earlier hardcore punk from like the 80s, I feel like it kind of has a bit of a dated sound to it in a way. But the later stuff, I feel like in the 90s, some of that still sounds pretty fresh today. I feel like maybe that's just my point of view, but what's your take?
No, I think you're right. I think it either completely works or it completely doesn't. But I think a lot of what was happening in the late 90s specifically is just the prototype that everyone's still riding now. It worked and it still works. So there's a lot of bands now that are just kind of studying that stuff.
Right.
Because it does work. Like a lot of those like metallic kind of mosh bands, that formula works.
Right.
Now it's like just normal mainstream music. It's just replaced hard rock. So it's clearly it works and the formula holds up because you can't escape it now. Like it's borderline like just civilian music at this point.
Right. Yeah. Not surprising that someone in their 20s would be discovering a band like Dragbody.
Yeah, it's really funny when we'll be at the shop and it'll come up and whoever will be like, oh, you were in that band? Like, yeah. And to me, like, I never felt like anybody truly gave a shit about that band until after we were done. So it's nice to hear people that weren't around then,
right,
that might have something favorable to say about it now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm proud of it. It was good.
Yeah. And it can take time.
Sure.
For something to marinate a bit over the course of time. And I think that's why you'll find people discovering music from 40, 50 years ago that no one cared about back then, and now it's like, wow, this sounds great today, and let's reissue this.
Yeah.
So with Rail Splitter, that obviously came after Dragbody, and one of the things I like about Rail Splitter, you mentioned the more like sludgy kind of doom kind of vibe, but also like a southern rock
Mhm.
kind of vibe too. Were you guys listening to a lot of southern rock?
I have always listened to all that stuff. Um, yeah, and I think we were just that was what we were writing. Like it was so different. Like Mike, our guitar player, is so different than what he was writing in Dragbody. Um, and Dan, our drummer, he was actually the drummer of Mid Carson July when we were touring with them. But Dan was from Valdosta, and Dan's like he's just a redneck punk, So like that shit to him was just kind of natural to write a bunch of those riffs. But yeah, that's just what was happening. We all already listened to a ton of Weed Eater and Bongzilla and shit like that. So it was something that Mike was trying to incorporate some of that into the last Dragbody stuff. But again, we never recorded any of it, so we were like, well, let's just keep moving in this direction since we were into it, and it was different.
How did you approach your vocals? Because they're different than the drag body stuff. So I mean, they at least sound different to my ears.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like I'm like on the album, I'm nearly like singing, which I'd never done before.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Case in point.
yeah, it was just like, let's just try something else. The first record we put out was 860 some odd pounds. That was more of a straight up kind of Weed Eater, like did some distortion on the vocals and it was really dirty. But then, like anything, as we played more, we kind of were tightening stuff up and adding some more mid-tempo parts in it. And yeah, Dan was just like, man, just try to sing this. Like, so I don't know. Some of it I listen to and I dig it, and some of it I'm like, what did I do? What was I doing there? But
were the crowds any different at a Rail Splitter show versus perhaps thinking back to some of the drag body ones?
honestly, it was mostly a bunch of people that didn't listen to hardcore anymore that just moved on to what was happening after that.
Yeah.
And yeah, we played some really good shows. We did that for a couple of years, and then during that time, I was actually supposed to play guitar and sing in Rail Splitter, but I couldn't do both. I hadn't figured it out yet, so I was just singing. And the band that we did after that was called Six Dead Horses. That band I sang in and played guitar. I wrote most of the music. That was the first time I'd ever had any input in the songwriting process.
Okay.
So for me, that band is probably, when I look back over everything I've done, I'm most proud of that because I was had the most involvement in it.
Sure.
Because me and the drummer John, we had written a bunch of songs before we had other players. So yeah, it just felt nice to have total control over song structure and just that kind of stuff, because I'd never had really much say other than like, let's play this more, let's change this for a vocal break or whatever.
Sure.
So yeah, Six Dead Horses was probably my favorite thing I've done. That recording is really good.
How were the shows for that band?
Good. That was the first time ever that I was playing music that from the jump people were coming to the shows. And we were also not playing a lot. We would only play, I think the whole time we had that band, we maybe played 12 or 14 shows. My daughter was just born. She was like, literally a baby. So my schedule was weird.
Yeah, I imagine that played a part
I
too.
also just opened up the tattoo studio that same year that she was born. So I just didn't have the schedule to like, go crazy on it. So we were being super selective, and it turned into getting offered all the good shows. And it was awesome. I
Yeah.
really liked playing guitar.
I was wondering about that too, because did you play guitar even prior to that? Just didn't really play it with any of the bands you were in, or was that something you
Yeah, I
learned
mean, I
later?
always like doodled around on the guitar,
Yeah.
but I can't say I ever got good at playing guitar. I could play the things I wrote, and you know, I never cared about playing anything else. So,
Right.
um, yeah, I was okay at best. I can't play anymore. Um, I can't tattoo anymore either. So it's kind of weird. In a weird spot.
Yeah. Is there a reason you can't tattoo anymore and play
I
guitar?
have yeah, I have a neurological condition that causes muscle seizures. I'm like losing the dexterity in my hands. So sometimes they work, sometimes they do whatever they feel like doing. It's just it got to the point with Six Dead Horses that every time we'd play a show, I would have to reschedule the next couple of days of work. So it was like I'm either playing shows or I'm working. I couldn't do both. So I went to playing bass in that band. We ended up having two bass players, two guitar players, which was super heavy. But even that took its toll, so I had to just stop. And
Right.
then a few years ago, like right before COVID, they told me to stop tattooing entirely, and I didn't. But now it's been about 2 years since I've been able to tattoo. Now I just pay bills and do that stuff, the
Yeah.
fun stuff of owning a business.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. And, and I think you mentioned when we were talking about a month ago that you were considering even doing another band or there was something in the works. Is that still?
yeah, we're doing a band. It's basically three of us from Rail Splitter. It's our bass player Phil. He's playing guitar. Dan's playing drums, and I'm singing. But it's like a kind of fastcore power violence kind of stuff. It's called Moving Digging Teeth. Um, Hopefully, we'll get something recorded here soon.
Yeah.
We got maybe 8 or 10 songs, and it's cool. I like it. It's kind of a combination of like definitely still has some like sludge riffs in it, but a lot of it is just kind of down tuned old hardcore, like almost youth crew hardcore on some of it,
Okay.
like super low heavy youth crew. uh,
Interesting.
yeah, it's fun. When Dan first started sending me the songs, I was like, it's pretty cool, like it's fast, and I wanted to play fast shit for a while again. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's just fast, heavy stuff. I'm into it.
It's like
Hopefully,
you're almost going back in time to some degree because when we're going way back in your early years, like I remember you saying, getting into the whole youth crew thing and now you're kind of
yeah, yeah. Dan,
doing that to some
yeah,
degree.
Dan is like he loves Instead and Chain Strength and all that stuff,
Okay.
but
Sure.
he he doesn't want to play that. And he writes these songs and he just kind of makes them heavy.
Right.
But yeah, it's interesting. Some of it is like, man, this just sounds like an Instead song.
Yeah.
And I think it's cool.
That is
It's
cool.
the closest thing to like a standard hardcore band I, I've ever done.
Right.
And I'm looking forward to playing some fast stuff. Yeah, it'll be fun.
I'm sure, after all these years and getting, into that. And I just on that note of youth crew, I want to bring up Tim Price because Tim got
Yeah,
us got us connected. And Powerhouse is one of those bands from
Yeah,
Miami. I mean, they were the only youth crew hardcore band in Miami back in that time, I want to say. And were you aware of what Powerhouse was doing at that time, and just
yeah.
your relationship with Tim, as he
I,
had been involved in the hardcore scene for a long time?
yeah, I didn't know Tim. I mean, I knew everyone knew Powerhouse, um, but I didn't meet. Our paths had crossed over the years, but Tim and I didn't start hanging out till like I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe a little longer than that, 10 or 12 years ago. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, he's like my brother now. Like he's one of my closest friends. Yeah, but yeah, I remember seeing him when he was playing with We're Fearing Weapons Meet, and
Right.
you know he was always around, but I didn't necessarily know him.
Sure.
So
Yeah. It's cool though how, even though you were connected in some way to scenes that intersected, years later, you could, form those friendships, and I'm sure it helped that he moved up your way too.
yeah, he was living with Ivan when we met. I actually met Ivan before I met Tim, and which I just thought was like, oh, Ivan used to sing in Powerhouse. That's
Right.
cool, you know. So yeah, it was cool. Like it, but a bunch of old dudes, really. Like, well, we're still here, so yeah, let's hang out.
I mean, you're about to start a youth crew hardcore band.
Yeah,
So,
we might have to figure out a different term for that. I'm looking forward to moving a little bit and falling down a lot. That's where I'm at with it. we'll
so
we'll see if there's any sing-alongs.
that's always one of the best parts of a youth
Yeah.
crew band is those
Put
sing-alongs.
the mic out to nobody.
There you go. Well, uh, I think it's been a fantastic time getting a chance to catch up and talk with you, Scott. We really covered a lot today as far as from what you've done from the very beginning, uh, from your influences to where you are currently. And it's great to just know that you're still out there, doing what you can to still be contributing to what's happening in the scene and the tattoo shop and all that. So, Rise Above Tattoos, just fantastic. Just getting a chance to connect with you. As we get ready to close things out, I would love to give you the last word. Any final thoughts you want to share to folks out there? I will turn over to you to take us home.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm still doing this because I don't really know what else to do. This is just what I do, and um, like I said, better or worse, it's just kind of who I am. I'm still love it, still interested in it. I don't have any words of wisdom. Just do what you want to do. You know, there's no law other than yourself. Bodily autonomy. That's all I got.